Good morning. A quorum being present, the investigative hearing of the Committee on Education and Labor titled Cases of Child Neglect and Abuse in Private Residential Treatment Facilities will come to order. Pursuant to Committee Rule 12A, any member may submit an opening statement in writing which will be made part of the permanent record. And I will recognize myself, followed by the Senior Republican member, Mr. McKeon, for an opening statement. I want to welcome everybody to today's hearing on cases of child neglect and abuse at private residential treatment facilities. For a number of years now, I've been deeply concerned about the allegations of child abuse in private residential treatment programs, which are often referred to as boot camps or wilderness programs or behavior modification facilities. These allegations range from neglect to torture, a word I do not use lightly. Today we will hear about neglect and abuse cases where the outcome was the worst one imaginable, the death of a child. We will hear testimony from parents of children who died, and I thank them for joining us today and for having the courage to speak publicly about their ordeals. It is estimated that hundreds of private residential treatment programs operate nationwide. The programs are governed, for the most part, by weak patchwork of state regulations. In many states, these programs operate without regulation, licensing, or accreditation of any kind, despite often exorbitant prices of tuition. Parents often send their children to these programs when they feel they have exhausted their alternatives. Their children may be abusing drugs or alcohol, attempting to run away or physically harm themselves, or otherwise acting out. They send their children to these programs because the promises of staff members will be able to help children straighten out their lives. In far too many cases, however, the very people entrusted with the safety, the health, and the welfare of these children are the ones who violate the trust in some of the more horrific ways imaginable. We're aware of stories where program staff members have forced children to remain in seclusion for days at a time, to remain in so-called stress positions for hours at a time, to undergo extreme physical exertion without sufficient food or water. And today we will hear evidence of even more horrifying stories of the children denied access to bathrooms, forced to defecate on themselves, of children forced to eat dirt or their own vomit, of children paired with older children, their so-called buddies, whose job it essentially is to abuse them. There is only one word for this behavior, and that is inhumane. This nightmare has remained an open secret for years. Sporadic news accounts of specific incidents have built a record that should never have been ignored, but shamefully it was. And the federal government has completely failed to grasp the urgency of this situation. In 2003, I urged then Attorney General John Ashcroft to begin an immediate investigation into reports of child abuse at private residential treatment programs. The Attorney General refused, as did his successor, Alberto Gonzales. I also then wrote Secretary of State Colin Powell asking him to investigate the treatment of children in facilities located overseas, but serving American children and operated by U.S. companies. Secretary Powell's response was insufficient. We will learn today that a number of these programs actually operate on federal land, yet no federal agency, not the Bureau of Land Management nor the Department of Interior, no one has thought to review problems associated with these federal tenants despite repeated incidents of injury or death of a child. No federal agency keeps official data about the number of children enrolled in private residential treatment programs, despite the fact that children are typically transported across state lines, sometimes even by force, in order to be enrolled in the programs. And I believe that that is an outrage. In late 2005, I asked the Government Accountability Office to launch an investigation of private residential treatment programs. The GAO agreed, and I am pleased that the GAO has devoted significant resources to this important issue. Today, the GAO will present case studies of programs where death has occurred. Next year, GAO expects to release an industry-wide review, thus providing us with a comprehensive look at the industry. In the past, it has been estimated that anywhere from 10,000 to 20,000 children are enrolled in these programs at any one time. I am sure that there are programs staffed by caring, professional, and competent staff members who do help to improve children's lives. Yet there are clearly a number of programs staffed by untrained, unlicensed, poorly paid staff members who simply cannot be entrusted with the child's welfare. As a result, without regulation, the industry as a whole will continue to present unacceptable risks to children it serves. That is why in 2005 I proposed legislation to provide resources to states to help them create licensing standards for private residential treatment programs. The legislation would also boost the oversight of facilities overseas operated by U.S. companies. This hearing, as well as the ongoing work by GAO and by the committee's investigative staff, will help determine if it is the appropriate legislative response or if the situation demands something else. One thing is clear, however, that in light of the findings we will hear today, Congress must act, and it must act swiftly, to ensure that the well-being of children participating in these programs. We can all agree we have no mandate more urgent than keeping children safe. And I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for joining us today. We will look forward to your testimony and working with you to put a stop to these abuses. And now I would like to yield to Congressman McKeon for his opening statement.
Thank the Chairman for yielding. Today's hearing will explore a difficult topic. The facilities we will be looking at receive no federal funding and therefore are not regulated by the federal juvenile justice legislation under this committee's jurisdiction. Nonetheless, the allegations of mistreatment raise a number of serious questions. I want to recognize the families who are here today and thank them for their willingness to share their personal stories. The loss of a child is something no parent should have to endure. I also want to take the opportunity to recognize the Government Accountability Office for its work in this area. Often on issues like these, where our jurisdiction as federal lawmakers may be uncertain, the GAO's work can help provide clarity. This includes an analysis of how these programs are funded and regulated, and what efforts are in place currently at the state level, but also perhaps at the federal level, to ensure the safety and effectiveness of the programs. We will also hear today from a researcher in this field, and on behalf of practitioners, the National Association of Therapeutic Schools and Programs, who can offer perspectives on the regulatory framework in place, as well as steps that can be taken to improve upon current requirements to protect the youth in these facilities. As I understand it, the work of the GAO has focused on the question of whether allegations of abuse and death at these residential treatment facilities are widespread, and on providing a review of the case studies. The GAO was unable to differentiate between public and private programs in determining how prevalent these allegations are, which demonstrates how difficult it may be to address this issue at the federal level. It seems to me that the question of how widespread these alleged incidents of mistreatment are is critical. Of course, even one incident of abuse or worse, the loss of life, is unacceptable. But before we consider federal intervention, we need to better understand the breadth of the problem so we can determine the best way to protect the youth in these programs. We need to take a step back to evaluate what an appropriate federal role would be, if any, in regulating these programs. This requires that we first understand current federal involvement, an area I hope we will explore today. Many of these facilities have been established to serve children who are deeply troubled, whether they are suffering from drug addiction or severe emotional or behavioral problems. Many of the youth who enter these facilities are placed there by their parents as a last resort. This committee has held a series of hearings this year to examine how we can improve our juvenile justice system. Our efforts have focused on identifying effective strategies that prevent juvenile delinquency and encourage healthy child development. Although these privately funded programs are not currently governed by the juvenile justice statute under our jurisdiction, I hope we can examine this issue through the broader context of juvenile delinquency prevention in order to understand how existing programs can meet the needs of troubled youth. Once again, let me thank the witnesses for being here to help shed light on these facilities, the role they play in serving troubled youth, and the efforts at the state and local level to ensure safety. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman for his statement. Without objection, all members will have 14 days to submit additional materials and questions for the hearing record. Before proceeding to introduce our witnesses, let me lay out the process we follow generally in an investigative hearing specific to this hearing. An investigative hearing differs from a legislative or oversight hearing in that the investigations may involve allegations that public officials acting in their official capacity or private citizens or entities have engaged in certain conduct that may suggest the need for legislative remedy. Because of the importance of getting complete, full, and truthful testimony, witnesses' investigative hearings before the Committee of Congress are sworn in, and our witnesses will be sworn today. I understand that some witnesses, as is their right, may be accompanied by counsel. While counsel are welcome to advise their clients, they may not coach them or answer questions on their behalf. House Rule 11.2K4 authorizes the chairman of the committee to, quote, punish breaches of order and decorum and professional ethics on the part of counsel by censure or exclusion from hearings, and the committee may cite the offender to the House for contempt. I will not tolerate any tactics designed to disrupt the purpose of this hearing, and I must say I don't expect any. To ensure that we have ample opportunity to flesh out the relevant facts for the record, I've exercised my prerogative as chair pursuant to Committee Rule 2B to extend the 5-minute rule for myself and for Mr. McKean. Following the witness's testimony, we will each engage one round of 15-minute questionings and then go to the other members of the committee under the 5-minute rule. I would like now to introduce our panel of witnesses. Mr. Greg Kurtz is currently the Managing Director of GAO's Forensic Audits and Special Investigations Units. Mr. Kurtz has testified and written investigative reports about federal government's handling of Hurricane Katrina and Rita, military pay problems in the Department of Defense, the smuggling of nuclear materials across our nation's borders, among other important issues. He will be accompanied by Mr. Andy O'Connell, who is the Assistant Director for Investigations at the GAO. Mr. Paul Lewis is the father of Ryan Lewis, who died in 2001. Ms. Cynthia Harvey is the mother of Erica Harvey, who died in 2002. And Mr. Bob Bacon is the father of Aaron Bacon, who died in 1994. Ms. Jan Moss is the Executive Director of the National Association of Therapeutic Schools and Programs, created in January of 1999. NATSAP, is that correct? NATSAP is a 501c6 not-for-profit trade association that represents therapeutic schools, residential treatment programs, wilderness programs, and other similar programs. And finally, Dr. Allison Pinto is a clinical child psychologist and research assistant professor at the Florida Mental Health Institute at the University of South Florida, where she coordinates ASTART, which is Alliance for Safe Therapeutic and Appropriate Use of Residential Treatment. Dr. Pinto has coordinated public awareness and advocacy efforts relating to the mistreatment of children in private and unregulated residential treatment facilities. She also serves as a principal investigator of a qualitative study regarding the experience of youth and families who have participated in the residential treatment programs. For those of you who have not testified, first let me welcome you all to the committee and explain that we will have a lighting system. When you begin your testimony, there will be a green light, which are on the tables, which will give you 5 minutes to testify. When you see the yellow light, it means you roughly have 1 minute in which to sum up your testimony. And when a red light, your time has expired, although we certainly want you to conclude your testimony in a fashion so you properly conveyed those thoughts at that time. And remind you that you have to turn on the microphones in front of you. Before we move on to the testimony, if each of you would stand and raise your right hand for the purpose of being sworn in. Do you swear that the testimony that you are about to give, that you will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record show the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Please be seated. We will now hear from our first witness, Mr. Cutts of the GAO. Welcome.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss residential treatment programs for youth. There are many who claim positive outcomes for troubled youth at these programs. At the same time, there are widespread allegations of death and abuse. My testimony today addresses these allegations. My testimony has two parts. First, some background and the scope of our work, and second, the results of our work. First, since at least the early 1990s, hundreds of residential treatment programs have been established across the United States. There is no standard definition of these programs and no way to know how many exist. There are no federal laws that regulate private programs. However, some states have statutory regulations that require licensing. Common names for these programs include boot camps, boarding schools, and wilderness programs. The first poster board shows examples of wilderness program settings which are typically in the mountains, the forest, or the desert. The second poster board shows first the restrictive nature of some of these programs, which you can see by the fencing and the cameras, and second, the military theme of other programs. All of these programs offer in some way to reform the lives of very troubled youth. The purpose of our work was to address allegations of death and abuse at these programs. Our focus was on private programs. However, our overall analysis of the extent of death and abuse included both public and private programs. It was beyond our scope to evaluate the benefits of residential treatment programs. Moving on to the results of our work, we identified thousands of reported cases of death and abuse at these programs. Sources of these allegations include HHS, state agencies, the Internet, and pending and closed civil and criminal lawsuits. Allegations include physical, emotional, and mental abuse. Examples of abuse include youth being forced to eat their own vomit, denied adequate food, being forced to lie in urine or feces, being kicked, beaten, and thrown to the ground, and being forced to use a toothbrush to clean a toilet, and then forced to use that toothbrush on their teeth. We took an in-depth look at 10 cases that were closed of teenagers that died between 1990 and 2004. Ineffective program management played a key role in most of these deaths. The next poster board shows 4 key themes from our case studies, which include untrained staff, misleading marketing practices, abuse before death, and negligent operating practices. I will now use these case studies to discuss these 4 themes. First, we found program staff with little or no relevant training. In many cases, program managers and staff misinterpreted signs of treatable conditions, such as dehydration. As a result, many of these kids died slowly while program management and staff continued to believe that they were faking it. It seems the only way staff could be convinced that these kids weren't faking it was when they stopped breathing or had no pulse. For example, in one case, a 16-year-old male exhibited significant signs of distress for nearly 3 weeks, including the loss of bodily functions. In 30 days, this 5-foot 10-inch boy dropped from 131 pounds to 108 pounds. Despite these warning signs, he was forced to continue hiking. There was no emergency response until he collapsed and stopped breathing. Unfortunately, at this point, it was too late. In another case, a 14-year-old male was forced to sit in the 113-degree sun for hours. He began eating dirt due to hunger, became dehydrated, and appeared to have a seizure. He was hauled in the back of a pickup truck to a motel, where he defecated and vomited on himself. Staff then pressed his stomach, and mud oozed out from the boy's mouth. They then cleaned him up, put him into the back of the pickup truck, and took him back to the campsite. He died shortly after this in a hospital. Another 14-year-old male showed signs of excessive body temperature and heavy breathing, but staff assumed that he was faking it. Although the boy became unconscious, staff continued to believe that he was faking it. The final check was for a staff to hide behind a tree for 10 minutes to see if this unconscious boy would actually revive himself. When the staff returned to the boy, there was no pulse, which finally triggered an emergency response. But once again, it was too late. The second theme was misleading marketing practices. Many of these programs took advantage of desperate parents misrepresenting that their programs were a perfect fit for these kids' unique issues. For example, as shown on the poster board, one program brochure touted their staff as highly trained survival experts with experience that was unparalleled. However, these experts believed that a 15-year-old female who was not eating and vomiting water was faking it. These experts allowed these symptoms to go on for 2 days until the girl finally collapsed on the road and stopped breathing. These experts became so lost that they wandered into another state. Lacking radios, these experts had to build a fire to signal for help. The next poster board shows the body of this girl who lay dead on the road for 18 hours until help arrived. Another program marketed its expertise in handling suicidal youth to the parents of a 14-year-old male who had twice attempted suicide. This boy committed suicide 6 days into the program by hanging himself by his tent. The parents later found that there was no specific suicide expertise in this program. However, the staff were experts in whitewater rafting. Our third theme was abuse of these kids before they finally died. For example, a 14-year-old male was forced to wear black clothing and stand in direct sunlight for several hours during the day. Despite strenuous physical exertion, he was fed an apple for breakfast, a carrot for lunch, and a bowl of beans for dinner. A 15-year-old male refused to return to a campsite after urinating. Although his refusal was not violent, 2 counselors forced him to the ground and held him face down in the dirt until he stopped struggling. One of the counselors was on top of this boy for 45 minutes. This boy died from a severed artery in his neck. Another 15-year-old male was dragged around when he was unable to exercise. As his condition deteriorated and he lost bodily function, he was forced to wear a 20-pound sandbag around his neck as punishment. The autopsy report for this boy showed 30 contusions and abrasions all over his body. As I'm sure you'll agree, there's no need for me to elaborate further on the fourth theme of these cases, the negligent and reckless operating practices of these programs. In conclusion, today's testimony reveals disturbing facts about the world of residential treatment programs. If you'd walked in partway through my presentation, you might have assumed that I was talking about human rights violations in a third world country. Unfortunately, these human rights violations occurred right here in the United States of America. Mr. Chairman, I want to commend you for holding today's hearing and putting a spotlight on this important issue. I also want to thank the parents who represent 3 of our case studies for having the courage to testify about the tragic death of their child. Mr. Chairman, this ends my statement.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lewis.
Chairman Miller and members of the committee, good morning. I'm here today with my wife Diana and my daughter Erin. The member of our family who is missing today is Ryan. Ryan lived his life to the fullest, surrounded by his adoring friends and relatives. He was a Boy Scout, a fire explorer. He was an avid outdoor enthusiast. He enjoyed kayaking, hiking, camping, and mountain biking. He read for hours and was a master of putting together complicated ship and airplane models. He was an all-American boy with sparkling blue eyes and a big smile that lit up his freckled face and our whole world. Ryan could weave an entertaining story and was oftentimes hilarious in his presentation. He had a remarkable way of relating to people of all ages and could draw anyone into a conversation on a variety of topics. He was sensitive to others and could articulate his views and feelings way beyond someone his age. He was a history buff and could match any adult conversation about World War II. In fact, one night we met 2 World War II vets in a restaurant, and one remarked that Ryan knew more about the war than he did, but he had been there. With all of Ryan's extraordinary qualities, he sadly suffered from clinical depression. He was a brave and courageous person who battled the darkness valiantly. But as a family, we knew that we needed help from professionals and sought out help from clinical psychologists and a child psychiatrist. In addition, Ryan needed an integrated program where he could continue his schooling and receive therapy while being among his peers. After exhausting all local resources to help Ryan, we reached out to Steve Bozak, an education consultant. We provided him with all of Ryan's educational and medical records. Given Ryan's background, he strongly recommended a therapeutic wilderness program named Aldridge Academy in Davis, West Virginia. He told us this would be the safest place for Ryan. Ryan's psychiatrist, after speaking to the admissions department, also agreed that this might meet Ryan's needs. Educational and medical records were then sent as detailed psychiatric information required on an extensive application. We were very hesitant to send Ryan so far away, but the program's marketing was first class, appearing to be just what Ryan needed. Aldridge used Ryan's love of the outdoors as a selling tool. The admissions personnel repeatedly touted their professionalism and expertise with children who had the same psychiatric diagnosis as Ryan. On February 7, 2001, we enrolled Ryan and were again reassured by the program personnel that Ryan would be safe. We called every day to inquire about how Ryan was doing. We were assured that he was just fine. On February 13th, only 7 days into the program, we were startled by a call at 11:15 at night. The news ripped through us like an explosion, tearing us into a million pieces. L.J. Mitchell, the owner of Aldridge Academy, informed us that Ryan had hung himself. He told us that there was no indication that Ryan was in trouble. It caught them all completely by surprise, and there was nothing they could have done. The next day, we flew to West Virginia and met with L.J. Mitchell, John Weston White, and Lance Wells, who repeated the same story as the night before. The story didn't make sense to me. The following day, we met with the investigating West Virginia state trooper, who told us that we were being lied to about the circumstances of Ryan's death. This news was like losing Ryan all over again. In his view, it was a death that could have been prevented. He told us that the night before Ryan died, he had slashed his arm 4 times with a pocket knife issued to him by the program. He told them, "Take this away from me before I hurt myself anymore. I can't take it anymore. I want to call my mom, and I want to go home." The counselors talked to Ryan for a few minutes, and he told them he was told that the people who could help him were coming out the next day. Then they gave him the knife back. L.J. Mitchell and John Weston Wright arrived the next day. Even though they called themselves therapists, neither one of them had any credentials that could remotely qualify them as mental health professionals. In fact, L.J. Mitchell is a lawyer. These individuals decided Ryan's desperate cry for help was manipulation, so he could get out of the program. Ryan was ignored, and consequently, approximately 7:30 on a cold, rainy night, desperate, alone, and abandoned, our son hung himself. 1 year later, Aldridge Academy, L.J. Mitchell, and John Weston White were indicted by the state of West Virginia for child neglect resulting in death. We were adamantly opposed to the plea agreement made that allowed Aldridge Academy, the corporation, to plead no contest in exchange for dropping charges against the individuals. Aldridge was fined $5,000 for the horrific death of my son. We filed a civil suit alleging wrongful death, fraud, and a tort of outrage. Once again, L.J. Mitchell was unable to defend himself and acknowledged fault. In spite of 2 court verdicts, L.J. Mitchell continues in this business today. In my opinion, as we sit here today, children are at great risk. Incredibly, Aldridge continues to be a proud member of NATSAP, National Association of Therapeutic Schools and Programs. Losing Ryan has been devastating to our family, our friends, and the people in our community. We miss him terribly and live with this nightmare every day. All we have left are the fragile memories of Ryan and the wonderment of the prospects that could have been. We don't want other families to suffer the overwhelming loss of a child in this fraudulent industry. We ask you, Congressman Miller, to do everything in your power to put an end to this gross abuse of our children. Thank you for the opportunity to share Ryan's story.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lewis, and the rest of your testimony will be placed in the record in this form. Mrs. Clark Harvey.
Good morning. My name is Cynthia Clark Harvey. Thank you, Chairman Miller, and those committee members present today for the opportunity to share our family's story. Our story is a personal tragedy, but please remember that for each family that has suffered the ultimate damage, the death of a beloved child, there are perhaps thousands of others who have suffered physical or psychological neglect and abuse. For those individual and family victims, there is no public acknowledgement of their sorrow and pain, as there has been of ours. This is Erica. Our firstborn, Erica, was an amazing kid. Everyone says that about their own, but it's true, she was. So many times during Erica's too short life, she'd do or say or create something that just knocked our socks off. Erica was an incredible student, straight A's with gifted classes in math and language. She was a competitive springboard diver with dozens of medals. Erica was a musician who played clarinet and drums, a prize-winning visual artist, a weekly volunteer with a local animal shelter from the time she was 10, and dragged us along so they got 2, 3, or 4 for the price of one determined little girl. But Erica's bright light seemed to flicker when at 14 and in the 8th grade, she began to experience mental health problems. Erica became depressed, then suicidal. She engaged in cutting behaviors. To medicate herself, she began abusing and using illegal drugs. Erica was hurting in many ways, and our whole family was suffering. Erica was in the care of a psychiatrist and a therapist who both recommended that we consider a residential treatment program. Michael and I were desperate to find help for Erica. Our daughter was 15 and a half years old when we made the decision to send her to what we believed was a legitimate treatment program, a place staffed with people who could help our family move forward from some very dark times. We compared several programs over a period of many weeks. We eventually focused in on Catherine Freer Wilderness because they were, and continue to be, leaders in the industry, one of the founding members of NATSAP and of OBHIC. We chose Catherine Freer because they claimed to be fully licensed, because they were JCO accredited, because they claimed experience with teens being treated with psychiatric medications. We, as parents, were interviewed by the program. We laid bare our hearts, our souls, and our story to the program. They told us our daughter would be treated by experienced staff, experienced therapists, and experienced wilderness guides and emergency medical technicians. They touted their backcountry planning and emergency procedures. They told us we could trust our most precious firstborn daughter, Erica, to them. On May 26, 2002, we arrived at Catherine Freer's Nevada office. We had been advised by Freer not to tell Erica we were placing her until our arrival for the family meeting that would begin the trek. Of all the many profound and tormenting regrets we have about our terrible decision, agreeing to deceive Erica is one of the worst. When we told her why we were there, she was shocked, angry, and scared. We will be haunted as long as we live by Erica's cry of, "Please, Daddy, don't make me go." On May 27, 2002, the first full day of Erica's Nevada wilderness trek, Freer's trusted team mistook a dire medical emergency for teenage belligerence, and Erica died that afternoon of heat stroke with dehydration. Over a period of hours, Erica's condition had worsened as she was pushed to keep hiking. When Erica's eyes rolled into the back of her head and she fell off the trail, head first into rocks and scrub brush, She was left to lie where she fell for 45 minutes while two FREER staffers, still unwilling or unable to recognize what was happening, watched Erica die a slow, painful death. When the FREER team finally responded to Erica's last few tortured breaths, they contacted their on-call medical doctor. But the doctor turned out not to be a doctor at all, rather a physician's assistant located in Oregon. They called the local authorities to ask for help and a helicopter to get Erica to a hospital. But they didn't know where they were because they sent the search and rescue team to the wrong GPS coordinates. The helicopter took hours to arrive because, contrary to the advanced planning that we were told to expect, no arrangements with local authorities had been made, nor was any sort of trip plan filed. Later, we found out that none of the FREER team had experience with administering psychotropic drugs and no training in how to evaluate those drugs' effects on an individual during a trek. We also found out that the EMT on the team was on his very first trek and had only recently completed coursework in WEMT and had never experienced a real medical emergency before. 6 days from today, October 16th, is Erica's 21st birthday. The day she was born, we held her, and we saw the universe in her fierce, dark eyes. We filled ourselves with dreams for her. We imagined who she'd be at 2, at 10, at 12, 21, 30. And today we're only left with memories, some of them beautiful, some of them harsh, and no dreams for Erica's tomorrows.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon, if you could bring the microphone closer to you. Thank you.
Chairman Miller and committee members, my name is Bob Bacon, the father of Aaron Bacon. Speaking for my wife and Aaron's mother, Sally, his brother, Jared, and his sister, Kia Sullivan, and speaking on behalf of the many families not at this table whose lives have been shattered by these fraudulent programs, we deeply appreciate your efforts to put a stop to this country's growing industry of institutionalized child abuse. During our search for the best alternative to the remaining 3 months of Aaron's sophomore year of high school, my wife and I spoke with therapists, counselors, pastors, and doctors until we were eventually referred by friends to North Star Expeditions, a now defunct but formerly licensed Utah-based program that billed itself as a wilderness therapy program for troubled teens. After reading their very compelling brochure, speaking to their office by phone, and finally meeting with the owners for a personal interview, we thought we had found the perfect situation. Caring people who were experienced in counseling kids who were struggling with drugs and social pressure. And to top it off, writing in a daily journal, we were told was an integral part of their so-called counseling program. As a writer, we felt journaling would help Aaron to sort things out. And we were certain that as a poet, Aaron would find the awesome beauty of southern Utah to be inspirational and spiritually healing. Of course, being normal, trusting, and honest people ourselves, we assumed we were being told the truth. We were dead wrong. His mother and I will never escape our decision to send our gifted 16-year-old son to his death at North Star. The guilt of our apparent naivete was crippling. We were conned by their fraudulent claims and will go to our graves regretting our gullibility. Adding further to our regret, we were talked into using their escort service. Aaron was taken from his bed at 5 a.m. on Tuesday morning, March 1st, 1994, by two burly strangers who announced to Aaron with a tone of authority that any resistance on his part would be countered with whatever physical force necessary. He was not allowed to speak with us or to put on any shoes. His eyes expressed a strange mixture of anger, despair, fear, and loving sadness. I was able to manage only the briefest of hugs, which being restrained, he could not return. In the trauma of this surreal instant, I offered words of comfort without thinking of their potentially ominous meeting when I said, "Aaron, I know you will find God in the wilderness." Little did I know that these would be the last words I would ever speak to my youngest son. His mother managed only a fleeting moment to cradle his face in her hands and utter her spontaneous words of love and the assurance that he would later see that this was really for the best. I cried inconsolably from the depths of my soul as the escort van backed out of our driveway with our terrified son pleading silently with his sad eyes for us not to send him away. This excruciating scene would have to serve for the rest of our lives as a last living memory of our beautiful son. Aaron arrived in the Escalante Wilderness area of southern Utah that same night and waited a few days for a brief intake exam, indoctrination into the rules of the program, and the issue of ill-fitting shoes and clothing. Aaron's body and her bloody and tattered journal, in fact, would contain no poetry, but would record in his own words an unbelievable account of torture, abuse, and neglect. A horrific tale that is corroborated by the journals of the so-called counselors, along with the journals and sworn testimony of his troubled young cohorts. A calendar was assembled by criminal investigators that chronicles 21 days of ruthless and relentless physical and psychological abuse and neglect. Aaron spent 14 of his 20 days on the trail without any food whatsoever, while being forced to hike 8 to 10 miles per day. On the days he did have food, it consisted of undercooked lentils, lizards, scorpions, trail mix, and a celebrated canned peach on the 13th. On top of this, with temperatures below freezing, he endured 13 of 20 nights with only a thin wool blanket, plus 5 nights without any warmth or any protection whatsoever. Aaron complained of stomach pain and asked to see a doctor as early as the 3rd day of hiking. And by the 10th day, he had lost all control of his bodily functions. But unbelievably, as he got weaker and lost nearly 20% of his body weight, they repeatedly refused to send him to a doctor. Taken from what appears to be the industry's handbook, their policy had predetermined that these kids are all liars and manipulators, and therefore Aaron was faking. This grotesque skeleton is what Aaron looked like the evening before he died. He was seen by Georgette Costigan, the registered EMT, who, still insisting that he was faking, didn't even take his vital signs, but instead took the occasion to barter a meager piece of cheese in return for his promise to try harder and to hike the following day. This company-employed EMT and relative of owner Bill Henry dismissed his final desperate plea to see a doctor who could prove he wasn't faking, and made a conscious decision to prove a point rather than render aid, thus effectively killing our son rather than saving him. What you cannot see in these photos are the bruises, cuts, lesions, rashes, blisters, and open sores that covered Aaron's body from head to toe. These scars of abuse and the dried skin stretched taut over his bones is what his mother and I were left to discover without any warning when the sheet was pulled back in the mortuary. This, we screamed, could not be our son. As we grabbed each other and collapsed to our knees, but the scar above his now sunken right eye told us that it was. It was in that one shocking moment of proof that our lives changed forever. The stories of Aaron's death and the others who have died or survived the abuses of these programs are chilling reminders of the dangers of absolute power and point out the extremely high risk we take in allowing these programs to operate without strict regulation and oversight. This country, this Congress, and this committee are faced as never before with several urgent and critically important choices. If we choose economic growth over human rights, if we choose no growth in government over the safety of our children, if we continue to place our faith in the self-regulation of private enterprise over the mandate of our government to protect our nation's health, safety, and welfare, we are choosing to fail in our sacred obligations to our children, our families, and our future. I implore you, as I know Aaron would, to please stop paying lip service to family values and start placing value in families. We can do this in part by investing the resources of the American people in our children who will soon inherit our challenging legacy. And we can start now by putting a stop to these fraudulent and destructive programs of institutionalized child abuse.
Thank you. Ms. Moss.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. McKeon, members of the committee, good morning. I am Jan Moss. I am a mother of 2 grown children and a grandmother of 3. To those of you who have spoken today of your devastating losses, I express my condolences, respect, and utmost deference. I have not suffered the loss of a child. I do, however, have a nephew who suffered abuse in an offshore program. I am here as the Executive Director of the National Association of Therapeutic Schools and Programs, generally known as NATSAP. We were established in 1999 in an effort to raise the bar of the private therapeutic programs serving children and families in crisis. Among our goals is the complete elimination of the abusive and neglectful practices we have heard about today. Clearly, we still have a very long way to go. Chairman Miller, you acknowledged in your December 2005 letter to the Government Accountability Office that there are indeed programs that provide high-quality services to help troubled adolescents get back on track. We are committed to ensuring that these programs remain available to families in dire need of help. We are working to ensure that the only programs on the market are those of the highest quality. NATSAP is the only entity in this country working with therapeutic schools and programs to improve them. We are a trade organization. We do not provide certifications or do we conduct investigations. Our principles of good practice are based on our 12 ethical principles and were formulated using the standards set by the Joint Commission, which accredits nearly 15,000 care programs in the United States. We will not accept or retain members that do not abide by our ethics or attest to following our principles of good practice. When we receive notification of a concern about one of our members, we review evidence from state licensing authorities, attorneys general, accrediting bodies, and other third parties. If a member has acted in a manner inconsistent with the law or our principles, we proceed on a case-by-case basis, either requiring the program to implement change or canceling its membership. NATSAP will review the findings of the GAO's investigation into NATSAP member programs and will take action as appropriate. Our professional development activities include a national conference which over 700 people attend annually. We hold 6 regional conferences with an estimated total attendance of over 800 individuals. Each conference provides continuing education courses led by industry experts, university researchers, and other clinical professionals. In 2006, NATSAP launched its first professional journal. Dr. Michael Gass of the University of New Hampshire is the managing editor. In 2007, NATSAP launched its research initiative, which will provide members an affordable data collection tool to evaluate the effectiveness of their clinical work. The University of New Hampshire will house the database, making it available not only to internal but also external researchers. Dr. Keith Russell from the University of Minnesota has just released the results of his 4 years of research on outdoor behavioral treatment. In 2007, the NATSAP Board of Directors strengthened its membership requirements. We now require members to be licensed by the appropriate state mental health agency or accredited by a reputable mental health accreditation organization such as the Joint Commission. Unfortunately, not all states have licensing requirements. We are working to address this inadequacy. We have worked successfully with the state of Utah to establish regulations for therapeutic boarding schools, which had previously escaped licensure requirements by claiming plain boarding school status. In Montana, we worked diligently to have appropriate licensure requirements put into place, but the stringent bill that we favored lost to a less rigorous bill. We continue to push for strong state licensure and monitoring requirements. We are hopeful that Chairman Miller, Ranking Member McKeon, and this committee will help us in these efforts. We need your assistance. The American Bar Association has submitted to this committee the ABA's recommendations for legislation to ensure the safety of children and youth placed in private residential treatment facilities. We are in fundamental agreement to the extent that the ABA recommends licensure and monitoring of these facilities. We expand on the ABA's recommendations by supporting licensure and monitoring of all adolescent treatment facilities, including those that are funded by public entities. Mr. Chairman and Mr. McKeon, NATSAP extends its sincere appreciation for your commitment to eliminating deceptive, abusive, and neglectful programs by encouraging state licensure and enforcement. We are committed to working with this committee, other organizations, and parents to draft and enact meaningful legislation to put an end to the horrific pain and suffering we have heard today. Thank you.
Ms. Pinto.
Good morning, Chairman Miller, Ranking Member McKeon, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify before you today, and I'm grateful for your leadership and your efforts to help protect youth from maltreatment by convening this hearing. I am Dr. Allison Pinto, and I'm a child and adolescent psychologist licensed in the states of California and Florida. I'm a member of the American Psychological Association, an assistant professor at the University of South Florida, and a researcher at the Children's Board of Hillsborough County, a children's services council in Florida. For the past 3 years, I have served as the coordinator of A-START, Alliance for the Safe, Therapeutic, and Appropriate Use of Residential Treatment. Each week, I receive phone calls and emails from concerned youth, family members, and professionals who are trying to navigate the increasingly complex world of residential services for youth, or to cope with the aftermath of their experiences. I've also spoken with a variety of individuals associated with a growing number of programs that are being framed as alternatives to traditional residential mental health care. Now, many parents and professionals are shocked by the descriptions of institutional abuse that continue to emerge regarding the care that American adolescents are receiving in alternative residential programs. In disbelief, they often ask, well, how do you know that these aren't just a few isolated incidents that have been sensationalized in the media? Or how do you know that these aren't just the complaints of manipulative, troubled teens or disgruntled parents? People are also in shock to learn that in many states, these programs are not required to be licensed or regulated with regard to the education, mental health care, and residential services that they provide. In order to address this disbelief and to gain a clearer understanding of the variety of residential services that are now available for youth, we posted an online survey to systematically gather reports from individuals who participated in residential programs when they were adolescents. Within 6 months, over 700 people responded to the survey. The detailed descriptions that young adults have been willing to share through this survey provide data that reveal a highly disturbing phenomenon. While there are youth and families who are satisfied with the services that they have received, a significant number of adolescents report maltreatment in programs across the country. Survey findings reveal the following. Reports of mistreatment, abuse, and neglect are widespread. There were concerns expressed regarding 85 programs located in 23 states and in several foreign countries. Facilities are not maintaining health and safety standards, and youth are experiencing medical neglect and educational deprivation. Incidents of physical and sexual abuse have occurred that were never reported by youth due to threatening program environments or the absence of universal access to protection and advocacy hotlines. Treatment is violating human rights. In the guise of behavior modification, youth are required to earn their basic human rights to privacy, dignity, and contact with family members. Youth are being deprived of food, sleep, and shelter. They are forced to endure stress positions, humiliation, and intentionally fear-inducing encounters. Programs are also using cruel and dangerous thought reform techniques. The use of seclusion and restraint is highly, grossly inappropriate. These practices are being used as punishments for rule violations rather than only when a person is a serious danger to themselves or others. Youth are enduring painful restraint practices, and isolation for periods of weeks, even months, has been reported. Youth have expressed profound distress about their residential experiences. For some respondents, the memories of their experience remain deeply disturbing and have led to a pattern of anxiety consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. So are these reports credible? Based on the level of detail and the overall coherence of the accounts provided, and using my clinical judgment as a child psychologist, I conclude that they are very credible. If those of us who are mandated reporters of suspected child abuse were to learn of this type of treatment occurring in a family's home, we would be required to file a suspected child abuse report so that the concerns could be investigated. We must consider the reports of maltreatment and abuse occurring in residential facilities just as seriously. Recognizing that the online reports provided are retrospective and are not necessarily from a representative sample of all individuals who attended residential programs, the survey findings nonetheless indicate that a serious problem has emerged. Because there are now hundreds of reports of abuse and neglect related to a diversity of programs across many states, these reports reveal a coherent pattern of institutional maltreatment. Once a pattern becomes apparent, it is not appropriate, scientifically or ethically, to dismiss reports of maltreatment as a few bad apples or a few noisy complaints. We must now acknowledge the problem in order to resolve it. Thank you again for the opportunity to present this testimony and for your efforts to safeguard and restore the well-being of American youth and families. I'd be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Thank you to all of you for your testimony. I can't think of testimony that we've received in this committee that has caused a greater sense of anger or sorrow than what we just heard this morning. Mr. Cutts, I would direct again my fellow committee members to the first couple of paragraphs in your summary. They're absolutely astonishing. in today's world when you say that we found thousands of allegations of abuse, some of which involved death, at residential treatment programs across the country and in American-owned and American-operated facilities abroad between 1990 and 2000. Allegations include reports of abuse and death recorded by state agencies, by the Department of Health and Human Services, allegations detailed in pending civil and criminal cases with hundreds of plaintiffs, claims of abuse and death that were posted on the Internet. For example, according to the most recent NCAN's data, during 2005 alone, 33 states reported 1,619 staff members involved in incidents of abuse in residential programs. Because there are no specific reporting requirements or definitions of private programs in particular, we could not determine what percentage of the thousands of allegations we found related to such programs. We also examined in greater detail 10 closed cases where teenagers died and while enrolled in the private program. We found significant evidence that the ineffective management in most of these 10 cases, with program leaders neglecting the needs of program participants and staff. This ineffective management compounded the negative consequences and sometimes directly resulted in the hiring of untrained staff, the lack of adequate nourishment, reckless or negligent operating practices, including a lack of adequate equipment. These factors played a significant role in most of the deaths that we examined. In the 10 facilities that you looked at, Mr. Cutts, where these children died, could you name those 10 facilities for the committee, please?
Yes, if you'd like me to go on the record with that, I would. We typically don't, but if you'd ask that, I will.
I will ask you to do that now.
I'll do them one by one. Number 1 was Summit Quest. Number 2 was Challenger. Number 3 is North Star. Number 4 is Obsidian Trails. Number 5 is the Aldridge Academy, which was already mentioned by one of the parents here. Number 6 was the American Buffalo Soldiers Reenactment Camp. Number 7 was Red Rock Ranch Academy. Number 8 was Catherine Freer Wilderness, which was also mentioned. Number 9 was Skyline Journey. And number 10 was Thayer Learning Center.
Thank you. A number of these facilities, if I understand correctly, have remained open. Which facilities are those? Some have closed for either related to these incidents or other reasons, but which of these remain open after these children have died?
That's correct. Some have closed, and there are 5 that remain open in some form, and I'll go through those with you also. Again, Aldridge, which was our case number 5. The Red Rock Canyon School, which was the parent of the Red Rock Ranch Academy, our case study number 7, is open. Catherine Freer, which was mentioned, is still opened, but it's open now in Oregon. The Nevada location related to our case study is closed. The Skyline Journey from our case number 9 is closed, but it now operates as something called Distant Drums. And then Thayer Learning Center, our case study number 10, is still operating.
From your investigation of these 10 deaths at these facilities, can you comment as to whether or not these deaths at these facilities appear to have been fully investigated?
Not necessarily. I mean, from a criminal standpoint, we didn't do an in-depth investigation of the quality. I would say that they weren't done of equal quality necessarily, but we didn't dig enough into that. From a criminal standpoint, there really wasn't a whole lot of result. There was one individual who was prosecuted and is serving concurrent 6- and 5-year sentences. The other prosecutions or pleas resulted in community service or probation, things like that. And in some cases, there were no charges at all made at the end of the day. So it was a wide variety, but very little criminal result for anyone involved in these cases.
Thank you. Ms. Moss, it's my understanding that 3 of the facilities that Mr. Coots just mentioned are NATSAP members. Is that correct? They remain
Yes.
open? And those are which?
Catherine Freer, Red Rock Canyon, and Aldridge Academy.
Aldridge Academy. I'm sorry. Mr. Coots, are there additional members? Or is there 3 or is there 5?
There are 3 current. There were 2 that are now closed that were NATSAP members. The Obsidian and Skyline were NATSAP members, based on our understanding.
Okay, but they're not. They're now closed, as I understand it.
Correct.
Let me just ask Mr. Lewis, Ms. Clark Harvey, or Mr. Bacon, just in a sense, what would you say to parents who are considering this alternative for their child? And I think we all recognize that very often parents are considering these alternatives because they don't know quite what else to do. It's not that they haven't tried a lot of things with their children, but they haven't worked out the way they had hoped, or become more difficult, or what have you. So it's a very difficult time for parents. But you've been there tragically. But what would you recommend to parents, Mr. Lewis?
In hindsight, I wouldn't let my son out of my hand, out of my sight. Nobody loves your children like we do. And to turn your child over to somebody else and hope that they're going to love and protect your child, I think was very naive on our part. I think that what we need to do as a society and a community is provide much stronger home-based programs for children that are struggling, so they stay with their families and they stay with the community that they know and loves them. You know, hindsight is a wonderful thing. We thought Aldridge was an answer to our prayers, and it turned out to be a living nightmare for us, and I can't imagine the nightmare it was for my son.
Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark, what do you?
I would have to agree. Our family, there is absolutely no way for any family to ascertain any of the claims that are made by these programs. There is just no way to do the amount of research and to determine whether it's appropriate or not. So I would make a blanket statement of, do not send your child to a residential treatment program far away from your home, because as things stand right now, you have absolutely no assurance that they will be taken care of.
Mr. Bacon?
I would like all of the parents to understand that the risks involved in sending your child to one of these programs are far greater than what you can imagine. In our case, we were weighing the risks of what we thought was an unhealthy environment in the public high school that our son attended, where there was drug use and peer pressure. The risks that we assume, and the risk that I think every parent assumes when they send their child to a residential program, is much higher than probably any risk that they can face near home.
Thank you. Mr. Coots, you mentioned one of your discussions was the question of misleading advertising or marketing or assurances to parents. Last night and early this morning, I was on the internet and sort of scooting around some of these sites, and it's a very seductive introduction to parents who are distraught, who are stressed, who have been dealing with this maybe for multiple years. They generally list a series of problems that children have: bipolar, schizophrenia, depression, drug and substance abuse, of all different segmented, a number of different ways, ADD, I'm trying to count, and the suggestion is that the staff can deal with all of these. Any one of those is a career for a professional. And all of my work in mental health and my wife's work in mental health and involvement with kids and this, the idea that you can just insert a problem and this counselor can take care of any number of these problems in an effective way is, I haven't seen it practiced that way except in these representations, the suggestion that they are trained, effective counselors for each one for these disorders. And of course, most parents in this situation would identify with one or more on that list. And I just wondered if you might address that.
Yeah, and I can speak to the 10 cases in depth, but the parents were pretty much told what they wanted to hear. As you said, it almost didn't matter what the circumstances were for the child, the programs were purported to be experts for those kids. And it went far beyond that. You had cases where you had no one that knew CPR in the entire program. You know, just something basic like that, where you're having kids out in the wilderness or at a boot camp or whatever, and no one knows CPR. So I think, and they marketed to the desperate parents. You heard these parents today. I mean, they were in a desperate situation. They were looking for something, and they were probably vulnerable at the time. I don't want to speak for them, but I think they probably were. I'm a father. I could see how that could happen. And I just think what you mentioned earlier, what the parents mentioned here for parents looking today, is buyer beware. Buyer beware. I mean, these are programs that, especially where there are unregulated programs in certain states, you really don't know what you're getting. Could I go back to the criminal also? The fact that there were not a lot of criminal prosecutions and documented evidence that the people that are dealing in these programs have a background. When parents are doing due diligence on these programs, an interesting point here is, how do they know that some of the people who were involved in the abuses and the cases that we talked about here aren't dealing in the current programs today? The answer is they won't know. And so it's a very difficult environment out there for parents.
Could you elaborate on the Thayer case, number 10, in the 10th case in your item?
Yes, and that's the most recent case from Missouri. Yeah, that was a case where I mentioned that was one where we believe that there was certainly abuse. And I read the autopsy report myself in depth twice, and I really couldn't believe it, actually. I mean, this kid had bruises, abrasions, and kind of signs of abuse from head to toe, from his head down to the bottom of his legs. And there was reports that he had been dragged around, and the other kids at the program had been forced to drag him around when he was unable to exercise. And I mentioned to you in the opening statement that when he was unable to exercise, then the penalty was not medical treatment, but to put a 20-pound sandbag around his neck and make him wear it around. So that is a case of absolutely clear abuse in my judgment.
You know, Ms. Pinto made the point, and I think it probably strikes all of us here. Had any parent engaged in any of this behavior against a child, they'd be in jail. Almost any singular incident of numerous incidents and ongoing activities against these children, a parent, a school teacher, a coach, they would all be gone. And I'll get into it later because I've got a second round of questioning here, but you know, my concern is that these people sort of reinvent themselves. They leave Nevada, they show up in Oregon, they leave this program, they rename themselves. I've followed some of these programs now longer than it took to cross the West by walking. I mean, you know, these people constantly are morphing themselves, and your point is you don't know who's quote, counseling your kid, whether there's criminal behavior, whether they've got their own problems. But, you know, one of the things that stuns me is the marketing of the wilderness and the outdoors and nature, and then to take people into the outdoors and the wilderness and nature and brutalize them in the name of the nature. I don't get it. I've backpacked for 30 years. I was on a trip this weekend on the high rims above Lake Tahoe in the aftermath of a snowstorm. And in that trip, we must have stopped 6 or 7 times and checked everybody on, saying, are we okay? Can you proceed? Do you think we should go back? We're this many hours into it. We've got this many hours of daylight. Is everybody drinking water? Is everybody snacking? Because we're burning a lot of energy because it's really cold. And for 30 years, I've hiked in that fashion with kids. I've had kids come into our camp in the middle of the night on different wilderness programs, but all of them were schooled in how to deal with the program. They were all given challenges, massive hikes. Really quite stunning what they accomplished. With a guide, with full education, with the dangers of how to take care of yourself, how to respond, how to handle the worst, and then the challenge is laid out. And I kind of understand that. I can see why that's used as a tool. But the idea that you take a person and you have her walk out in 100-degree weather and somehow this is good for you and nobody's paying attention to dehydration, nobody's paying in the name of the wilderness that this is therapeutic, no, this is abuse. And, back to your point on mismarketing, it's a wonderful thing for parents to think, geez, maybe get my kid out of this neighborhood and we can start over, and they can go out there and they'll be fishing and they'll be swimming and they'll be doing all these things. You know, it is just outrageous that they would suggest that somehow you can have a positive outcome with these children by using the outdoor experience as an abusive action against children. It's just stunning to me. And it's contrary to any norm of anybody who's been out in those situations, especially when you have young people with you in terms of learning about the outdoors. And this whole marketing, I mean, as I went on these websites one after another, and then when you look at the cost, I don't, Ms. Cutts, I have about 30 seconds. If you could just outline what you saw in terms of some of the costs.
The cost is fairly interesting. I mean, and this is all in 2007 dollars, but the range was $131 to about $450, and the average was $300 per day, which is about $2,000 a week. And so the cost of this is very significant. And that's for the 10 cases that we looked at, certainly. Now, we've looked at other ones that are in that kind of a price range. So $300 a day was the average cost.
Thank you. Mr. McKeon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just asked the chairman kind of what he plans on doing about this. It's the first I've heard of these abuses going on. I have a couple of friends that have sent their children away to schools and didn't have any of these kind of problems. But one death is more than should be tolerated. Question. Ms. Moss, in your report, you talk about a Joint Commission, 15,000 programs. Was that correct?
The Joint Commission accredits over 15,000 health care.
Programs such as these?
Yes, not all
What
like
is the
these. There are
point?
psychiatric hospitals, medical hospitals. So it's over 15,000 that they accredit.
How many of these programs are in your association?
Of the that are accredited by joint commissions,
Well, just how many are in your program?
we have 180 programs, sir, as members of our organization.
And do you know how many children are enrolled in these programs, these 180?
The information that I received last year when we did our 2006 annual renewal is that there were approximately 16,000 children served in our programs, in our member programs during 2006.
16,000. Do you have any idea how many deaths have come from those 180 programs or out of those 16,000 youth?
In 2006, sir, I don't recall immediately. Our organization has grown from a starting point of 6 programs to the 180 this year. I'm sorry, I don't have that information at my hand right now.
Mr. Cutts, do you have any idea from your investigation how many deaths have resulted from these programs?
No, we don't. We just know that there are thousands of cases of reported death and abuse. There is no real central repository.
Excuse me again. Thousands of
Death and abuse, mostly abuse, but there are other reports of death. There's just no way to quantify. There's no good centralized source in the federal or state governments to quantify this.
It's amazing to me. As the chairman said, if a parent just were reported abusing a child, the children would be taken away from them. They'd probably go to jail. And they'd have to prove their innocence. And yet here we have, just from the witnesses here today, 3 deaths. And it looks to me like there's no criminal action taken except in the case where we had a $5,000 penalty and some kind of probation or something. What are the police doing about this? I mean, deaths are pretty serious, and nobody's taking any action?
Well, I can just answer this. For the 10 cases, we did look at police reports. There were extensive investigations done in most of the cases. And again, it ranged from only one person is serving time today from case study number 6 for manslaughter and I believe another charges, concurrent 6 and 5-year sentences. Everyone else, as I mentioned, either was prosecuted and or pled, either got community service or time served or some lesser charge. So there was really no teeth behind the investigation. Doesn't mean they weren't good investigations. We didn't really evaluate the quality of the investigations, but there was really no action on the criminal side here.
This just boggles my mind. I can't even imagine how this, Mr. Bacon?
In the case of our son and North Star Expeditions, it was a program licensed in the state of Utah. It was operated, owned by two gentlemen who were previously field counselors in the Challenger program where a young woman died. They, in the investigation on the former death, these two people turned state's evidence against that owner in exchange for assisting the state of Utah in writing the regulations for the state of Utah and a license to operate their own program. So when our son died, there was an immediate investigation that was brought about by the county attorney in Garfield County. We were very fortunate that in the sheriff's office, there was an experienced homicide investigator who arrived at the scene first. From the evidence that she collected, it became clear very quickly to the county attorney that this was a very suspicious case, and he called into the state of Utah to the Attorney General's office and asked them to assist in the investigation. As a result, both owners, I believe that there were 7 people, I'm not sure about the exact numbers, but counselors and owners, EMTs, were charged with felony child abuse and neglect to report child abuse, among other misdemeanor charges. All of them pled guilty to lesser charges, were given probation and community service, and told that they couldn't work in child programs after this. There was one counselor who decided that a felony didn't mean that much to him, so despite the fact that the plea agreements were supposed to prevent us from the agony of going through the trial procedure, we had to do that anyway. He was found guilty of felony child abuse. The judge sentenced him to 1 year in jail and community service. He was out in 2 months, and we were informed that at that point, it was no longer about Aaron Bacon. It was about what was good for the Craig Fisher. The judge told us it was no longer about what was right for Aaron Bacon. It was what was right for Craig Fisher. And he got off with 2 months and community service.
I'd like to yield to Mr. Platts some of my time at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member McKeon. First, certainly add my words of sympathy and the loss of the loved ones of our family members here today, and thank all our witnesses, and especially you, for your courage in sharing your family stories, that we may do our best to see that they're not repeated, and the tragedy that your families have suffered are not repeated in other families. Mr. Coots, in your investigation, it seems that your focus was private programs, not public, but you do reference an ongoing investigation that is going to be more comprehensive. Is that correct?
Yes, a more comprehensive look at the...
Would that include public and private to give us an understanding of maybe what is better?
Yes, it'll include both.
What's the time frame for us getting that information?
I believe early next year.
Okay. In the 10 cases specific that you did investigate, how many, if any, of those were cases in states where there was state licensing in place?
Several were and several weren't. It was mixed.
And the ones where there was the response then more appropriate? I mean, I agree with the chairman, the ranking member. When you read these cases, and Mr. Bacon just citing the example of his son's repercussions, the consequences are unbelievable. There weren't any. I mean, lives were taken in a horrific manner. And was it any better in any sense with those with state licensing?
With respect to that, where there was state licensing, there were several cases where the licenses were revoked, and so there was some action on the license. Again, I mentioned not much on the criminal side, but on the licensing side, licenses were revoked or possibly permits on federal land. One of the things here is some of these were on kids died on federal land also. Yeah. Permits were revoked there also.
The you reference in your written testimony that that states, while they don't often regulate the private, that they more often regulate publicly funded programs. Did you get into how, in detail, in what way they regulate the public funded in this report?
No, I don't have any direct knowledge of the public.
Of those that are privately regulated, private entities that are regulated by states, was there a state that you would point to us as the best model for us to look at to say this state seems to be doing it better than anyone else?
I think that that'll be probably our report next year, but I know that talking to my staff, Utah has gone through several revisions because a lot of the cases here happen in Utah. There's been increases in the requirements in Utah. I think several iterations of that. Whether that's the model or not, I can't speak to that, but there's been a lot of activity from a legislative standpoint in the state of Utah.
I think that would be helpful.
The gentleman would just yield for 1 second. I just want to inform the members of the committee that I think there's a little less than 5 minutes now on the roll call vote. We will adjourn recess for the votes, and we will come back immediately after. Hopefully that's in 20 minutes or so. The gentleman's free to go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to wrap up quickly here to give the ranking member back. Of that ongoing study, I think it would be very helpful if part of that investigation is kind of the best models out there that we can learn from to then try to look at how to replicate elsewhere. A final question, Ms. Moss. You mentioned 180 programs that are currently members.
Yes.
And in your testimony, you talked about they have to have a state license or a accreditation from
Mental
a joint
health
commission.
Accreditation. Yes, sir.
So all 180 of your programs have that?
The board ruling went into effect the 1st of May, where all new members have to be licensed and or accredited, and they also have to have oversight by a licensed clinician. In other words, somebody that has a state licensure. The current members, those that have been members of our organization, have until January of 2009 to obtain that licensure and or that accreditation. And the organization is working with other states as well as with other accrediting agencies to make sure that those accreditations are available. In 2009, if we have a current member, whether it's a founding member or any other member that has not received that licensure or accreditation, they will not be a member of our organization.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Mollison. To our family members, I especially want to thank you again. As a parent of an 8-year-old and 11-year-old, I cannot imagine the anguish that you've gone through, and your willingness to be here today is going to help save the lives of other children in the future, and I sincerely thank you. I yield back to the ranking member.
The gentleman has 2 minutes.
Again, I would like to thank you for being here, and I'd like to thank you, Mr. Cutts, Mr. O'Connell from the GAO for this study. I hope as we move forward on this issue that it doesn't become a partisan issue, that this is something that we can work together on to better the situation. I'm sure that there are young people that have gone to some of these programs that have benefited. I would imagine out of that many people, but I think it's something we really need to look at. What concern I have is if there's no, apparently law enforcement just doesn't get involved in these things. So if you can have a bad actor, and it seems like whatever field you're in, you can find bad actors. We could find doctors that have had real problems in their lives. So I think it seems like people just gravitate to wherever they can do the bad things they want to do. And my concern is that if there is an incident such as these where deaths occur and abuse, and there is some attention brought to them, and maybe there is some slight action taken as we've seen here, it might shut them down. They might move to another state and start all over again, and nobody has any way of knowing problems. So that's something I think that we really need to look at. I'm generally, opposed, as Mr. Bacon maybe pointed out in his opening comments. I don't like to see federal legislation, but there are some times where it has to happen. And if you have a situation like this where people can go from one state to another to avoid prosecution, might be that federal legislation is needed. And I appreciate, Ms. Moss, what your organization is trying to do, where you say if some way you can clean up some of the bad apples. I've seen it in other organizations that we deal with where it has been effective, but sometimes it's not enough. And I think that's something that we need to address, and I appreciate the chairman holding this hearing.
Thank you very much. We'll recess, and hopefully we'll be back here in about 20 minutes. Thank you very much, and thanks for sticking with us, because we have a few more questions we'd like to ask you. Thank you. Thank you very much for bearing with us here in our crazy congressional schedule. I'd like now to recognize Congressman McCarthy from New York for questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for bringing this to everybody's attention. To the family members, I know it's been a very troubling journey for all of you, but with you being here today, you're bringing this to a national attention, and with all the pain and suffering that your families have gone through, you can make a difference and hopefully prevent another family going through what you have all suffered these last several years, and my heart goes out to you. With that, Mr. Kutz and Ms. Morse, many parents put their children into these programs based on snazzy and, in some cases, according to your reports, misleading marketing products. I imagine these marketing tools do not include any information on incidents of crime, violence, accidents, or deaths. In 1990, Congress passed the Clery Act, which requires colleges to notify parents about campus crime annually. I am shocked that there is no similar requirement for children in these residential programs, who are arguably even more vulnerable than our college students. I'm also shocked that owners and program leaders aren't required to disclose if they have previously had to shut down a program and under what circumstances. It's totally unacceptable that parents are not informed, and families involved in these programs, they should have a parent's bill of right. Do you think if these residential treatment facilities should have to disclose violent incidents, accidents, and deaths in their marketing materials, or to the parents of enrolled children on an annual basis? Mr. Klutz?
Well, I would say that they didn't do that, and with respect to disclosure to the parents of what was actually going on, not only did they not tell them what was going on, I believe in many cases we saw that they lied to the parents, and they misrepresented what was actually happening. Certainly it would seem that has merit, having some disclosure requirements here, and again, you got to have teeth behind that somehow. I don't know how you get that, but some teeth behind disclosure of what's going on would have some merit.
In your report, did you find that even those that were hired into these particular programs, did anybody do any background checks on them?
I think there were some that did and some that didn't. We did have one case where there was an ex-con that was handling kids, so somehow that person got through, but I don't even know what the requirements were. There were no licensing requirements. There weren't any real standards there, so I don't even know what the criteria was they were using to bring people in. I believe in some of the states now that have licensing requirements, a background check is one of the things that's required in some states.
Ms. Morse?
On the question of disclosure, one of the things that we always recommend when a parent calls is they need to check with the state licensing agency to see if there's anything in the background of that program. We also stress the fact that if there is no licensing agency, they need to contact the Attorney General's office to make sure that there's nothing in that background.
But how do we get this information to these parents? I mean, obviously, usually the parents are so distressed by the time they even come to this situation where they're trying to find the best treatment for their child, and there's so many programs out there. Half of them are not even registered with the state. It's kind of hard to guide.
It is very
They
difficult.
did their due diligence. They looked at all the, they asked the right questions, and yet they ended up with, unfortunately, their children dying.
I don't think any of our NatSat programs would be opposed to disclosure on that.
Okay.
What do you think about having some data where we can, have data like where parents could go on to the website when they would be looking? I'm sorry, did you want to ask, Mr.?
Yes, we, about 3 or 4 months after the criminal case was resolved in relation to our son, I had called the people at Aldrich Academy, and I talked to the woman that we had originally talked to when we placed Ryan, and I presented myself as a parent that was looking into the program. And I said, I understand you have some legal issues that have been, I've read about a little bit online, and I'm concerned about it. And her response was, well, that's all been taken care of, and the family's very happy with the result. And that couldn't have been further from the truth. So that's the information that they were telling people if they were to call them and ask about my son's death. They clearly misrepresented our position on the whole matter.
Thank you. Mr. Bacon, you mentioned earlier in your opening statements that you were talking about we here have a responsibility, certainly after looking for, taking care of and looking to make sure our children are safe. One of the things that I was thinking of, as you said, right now we have a mortgage crisis going on. One of the problems was that those that unfortunately were doing predatory lending might have been kicked out of the state. That did not stop them from going into another state and doing the same thing. I see that we seem to have the same case where one particular program was closed, reopened up into another case, another program in another state. So again, this is where data and the collection of data from state to state, so the states would also have that information. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, it isn't just the programs moving from state to state, it's really the people. Because you can change the name of a program. We see it in a lot of the investigations we do in many different things. It's easy to start up a new entity and just shuffle the deck and reemerge somewhere. So that appears to be a real issue here.
I'm looking forward to your second report in February. Appreciate it, and I thank again everybody's testimony. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Moss, you mentioned that when you get a complaint that you look into that complaint case by case. How many have you proceeded on case-by-case complaints?
Could you clarify proceeded on?
Yes, you stated that when you get a complaint about an organization, that entity that belongs to your organization, that you examine that complaint or proceed on a case-by-case basis.
Right.
That was your words. How many have you proceeded on?
As far as closing down, they were, or canceling their membership, sir, the two that we would have canceled their membership were closed prior to cancellation of the membership.
So have you proceeded on any of these complaints case by case?
We did evaluate the Catherine Freer and the Aldrich Academy cases. There was no criminal negligence found and no wrongdoing found, sir. Therefore, they remained members.
So there's one or two, then, that you've proceeded on a case-by-case basis at all?
On the ones that have been reported to us, yes, sir. In this case, in the deaths, yes.
There's only been one or two reported to you?
Right, on the deaths. The others that have occurred, sir, we have received the reports on those, and also have found no negligence, no wrongdoing, no criminal action found.
But again, you've only received one or two complaints, and you stated that you proceed on a case-by-case basis. It didn't take very long, then, if only one or two, then.
Sir, I misunderstood the question. I thought you were referring to the ones here. in this hearing?
No,
There have been
I'm
others.
referring-
Yes, sir, there have been others. I don't have the numbers that we have.
Do you have any idea about how many you proceeded on a case?
During my tenure, sir, there's probably been about 5 or 6.
Could you supply the records of that case-by-case, those case-by-case interviews to this committee?
I can certainly try to do that, sir, yes.
I need more than try.
Okay, yes, sir, I can do that.
All right. Because if we don't, Mr. Chairman, I would suggest that we subpoena the records then, but if you
I will
could
provide them to you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Coots, let me take you back to the Thayer Learning Center, if I might. Is it correct that the cause of death to date is a spider bite?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
And this is the incident which you talked about earlier, where in reading the autopsy report and going over the autopsy, this was a child that was badly bruised. Am I?
30 bruises and contusions from head to toe, yes.
So what's your thinking in reconciling a spider bite as a cause of death and what appears to be very substantial?
Well, I think there were two things going on. There was the abuse going on, and then there were the signs of other things related to the spider bite. So there was a medical issue, and then at the same time, they were misinterpreting the medical that he was faking it or for some other reason. So they were abusing him because he appeared to be lazy or appeared to not be actually exercising. So I think a lot of the abuse came because of the spider bite, because he was exhibiting symptoms that they thought, again, they misinterpreted as faking it.
And what is the status of that investigation?
There is no ongoing investigation there that we're aware of.
That case, what's the status of is it a closed case or?
There were no charges filed in that case. There was a civil settlement for $1 million in that case.
And Thayer remains open, is that correct?
Yes.
Well, I don't know. We'll have to look at that. I think there's something glaring in this case, and you know, I've previously asked the Justice Department to look at this business. They've refused, but maybe on a specific case, they can find new interest. When you have a child that appears, as you represent the autopsy, to be this badly and systematically abused, there's got to be some other interest here.
Mr. Chairman, if I could add something to the
Yes.
to the Thayer case. We talked to the prosecutors who said there was not enough evidence to prosecute. However, the state's Family Services Division did find that there were patterns of neglect and abuse at Thayer.
Yeah, I think, as you said, if you walked in the middle of this testimony, you think we were talking about human rights abuses in third world countries. I have to believe that there is, in fact, a federal interest in this, in the treatment of these children, and I think that at a minimum, in a particular case, we might very well be on solid ground asking for oversight by the Justice Department of the death of that individual. You also mentioned, Ms. Coots, that one of these programs is operating on Aldridge Academy is operating on federal lands. They're with the Bureau of Land Management or Wetlands Forest Service Bureau.
That one's Forest Service, Mr. Chairman.
That's Forest Service?
Yes.
And they've been on that land how long?
About 10 years, I understand.
My understanding is they're in arrears on their rent?
Correct. They have not filed usage reports for, I believe, 8 years, and they will owe the federal government tens of thousands of dollars. So their permit is invalid, basically.
Would that send you a signal as a trade association, Ms. Moss, that something might be amiss if people hadn't paid their rent for years?
Yes, sir.
So what have you done in that situation?
I haven't paid their rent
Yeah.
For the federal land.
Yeah.
We're not familiar with what programs operate on federal land or not, sir. So if they did not pay their membership dues, their membership is
So
canceled.
it's all about their membership dues.
No, sir, it is not. It is not.
Well, I'm trying to figure out what else it's about because you can't find any evidence of abuse. You don't know the financial situations. I'm just trying to figure out what your association is about.
If there is findings of wrongdoing, sir, or criminal action taken, or ethical violations.
By outside organizations.
Yes, sir, we do not do
You don't do your own investigation.
We do not do our own investigations, sir.
You don't do your own looking at the quality of these organizations.
No, sir, we do not.
Essentially self-certify.
They are not certified by our organization. We are not an accrediting agency. We're not a licensing
What the
agency.
hell do you do?
We are a trade organization, sir, that is focused on improving the field of therapeutic schools and programs.
Isn't that marketing?
Well, but as I read your testimony, and correct me where I'm wrong, you say that these programs that you don't, we proceed on a case-by-case basis, either requiring the program to implement change. Where have you done that?
There have been ethical principles, ethical violations that have been filed with us, ethical complaints that have been filed with us. In one case, there was a marketing issue that there was a misstatement on their website. We investigated that. We found that to be true, or not investigated it. We researched it, talked to them, and they removed that false advertising on their website. So they did make the corrective action.
Okay. Anything else on their website and that marketing thing set off any bells and whistles for you?
I do not evaluate their marketing, sir.
So, and you've canceled memberships?
Counsel them, sir?
Canceled.
Have we? Yes, we have, sir.
For what purposes?
For an ethical violation. Primarily, most of the cancellations have come after they've lost their license.
Okay. So this would be a violation of your principles of best practices that you testified to in your statement. Is that what it is?
Yes. I'm sorry, sir. I'm not understanding the question.
Well, I'm trying to figure out what the ethical violation is. Kids dying and being abused in a rather wholesale fashion, and you say that there's been a cancellation or there's been somebody had something wrong on their website, and that violated the ethical standards. I just wonder where abuse of children falls in those ethical standards.
Sir, we look to the third-party investigators to advise us as to what the actions were taken, what their findings were on these investigations.
So essentially, you're an organization where these people self-certify that they will adhere to the principles of your best practices, which are based on 12 ethical principles which were formulated using the standards of the Joint Commission. So it's not like they're adhering to the Joint Commission. They're self-certifying that they'll adhere to 12 ethical principles that were formulated with those standards in mind.
Yes, sir, but we require the licensure and accreditation. I have to have the license on file. We look to the state, sir, not to this association.
What kind of license do you have to have on file?
We have to have a mental health agency license on file or an accrediting agency, which is a mental health accrediting agency. Those are our new membership requirements.
Are there schools in your program that are members of your trade association that do not have those requirements because they're not required by the state?
At this time, that is true, sir. That will not be true in 2009, as of January 1st of 2009. That's why we've been working so hard.
So if they're not in a state that doesn't require this, they will no longer be eligible.
They will no longer be eligible for membership.
Do they have to have also? Do they have to have a license from the Department of Education?
Could you state that again?
Well, some of these programs represent that they're also doing schooling at the same time. Do they have a license from the Department of Education?
Most of them do, sir. That do offer high school credits or high school diplomas. But that will no longer be accepted as an accreditation or a licensure within our organization.
But would they have to then have both? Would they have to have mental health and education?
If they offer high school credits and a high school diploma, they will have to be accredited by an academic accrediting body. The licensing will depend upon the state, sir. I'm not familiar with all of the educational licensing, so I believe that would happen on a state-by-state basis. Some states require that the private schools are licensed, others do not.
Mr. Kreutz, what did you find in the universe of licensing here? Who was licensed, what were they licensed to do, and was it relevant to what they were doing?
Some of our 10 case studies were licensed, and other ones there was no licensing requirement. As I mentioned in one of the earlier questions, in some cases where the entities here had deaths and there were violations of the licensing requirements, their license was revoked in the state, but it was only after a death had occurred that happened, which raises questions about what kind of due diligence is being done absent a death or significant abuse at these places. And I think our broader study is probably going to look at that for you.
But let me ask you this. Are all of the licenses that they have related to their activities, or do they also have activities that aren't licensed?
There are some activities they were doing that they weren't licensed for. Yes, we did see that. I can't remember.
And again,
the specifics,
and I'm not. I don't mean to hold NATSAP responsible for all this activity, or the industry responsible for all the activity. But when I cruise, when I look at these sites, it's very interesting. Sometimes they'll tell you they are licensed to State Department of Education, but they list a whole series of mental health treatment activities, and there's no mention of accreditation, licensing, or anything. And that would not be true in NATSAP as of 2009, but I'm trying to, what would a parent rely on? I mean, the word accreditation and training is thrown around in these marketing paragraphs. You know, you would think you were dealing with John Hopkins, okay, but you're not. But they constantly, intersperse those words in the marketing, and so you don't know if the accreditation and licensing pertains to the mental health services, to the educational services, to the medical services, because it's it's pretty clever pieces of writing.
It's very difficult. I couldn't have said it better than you just said it. I mean, it's very difficult for a parent to wade through this and figure out what exactly is going on, and something that might appear to be there that looks like you said, Johns Hopkins or something like that, might be nothing there. I mean, in some cases, the medical officer was also running the kitchen. And when you looked behind the medical officer, they had no medical training. They weren't a licensed anything. So they were self-proclaimed in many cases experts in things with no credentials behind them.
Well, that's why I worry that again, I look at Ms. Mossy, your testimony that you're holding these people to ethical principles and so forth, and yet when you look at how these a number of these children died, dehydration, heat exhaustion, dehydration, head trauma, which was probably maybe caused to dehydration, loss of consciousness, dehydration, heat stroke, hyperthermia, another form of dehydration. You don't get very far in training before you tell people how dangerous and fatal dehydration can be, especially if you have a program that's designed to be in the desert. I mean, I don't get the ethical standards here or the professional standards of the training where people would not recognize and prevent, in fact, prevent the dangers and the fatalities related to dehydration. I mean, this is like Care 101.
Sir, this is the first we have heard of the circumstances of these deaths. We will take these back to the board and we will review them in depth.
Mr. McKeon said there's a lot of room here for something in terms of oversight. I also serve on the Resources Committee, so is the Forest Service looking at their arrears payment?
That's something we would refer to them, certainly. We do referrals of various things.
We'll do a referral along with
official notice to them of what we identified, yes.
One of my concerns is, again, my experience with some of these organizations is, in some cases, there's a substantial investment being made In other cases, there's not much investment at all, and you're wandering around on federal land. We've had Conestoga wagons wandering around in the Southwest for a number of years, and there's really no investment. And when they had trouble in Arizona, they simply moved north into Nevada and continued their activities. So it's not like, so if somebody's not paying the rent, bells and whistles might go off on whether they're paying properly trained people and skilled people to watch after these young people.
Well, in the case here of the Forest Service, they weren't aware that for 8 years they had not been receiving reports from Aldridge, and that the fees had not been paid until we actually talked to them. And then they were like, oops, looks like we have a problem. So that raises questions on the other. We didn't look at that, but it raises questions on both sides.
If you knew how they treated inholders on some federal land, you'd wonder what they're thinking. Let me stop there and see if Mr. McKeon or Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee?
Just another question to Ms. Moss, and I do look forward to some documentation that you'll supply us as how you responded in a case-by-case basis to complaints or information you had received. But what do your members gain by joining NATSAP?
They gain continuing education with our conferences. They gain the journal. They gain access to others in this profession. They gain insight into the newest clinical studies. There are many clinicians in our organizations that present at our conferences. It's basically an education type of benefit. With the new research initiative they will gain from that, they will be able to...
What have they? How many conferences do you have a year?
We have one national conference a year, and we have 6 regional conferences a year.
It would seem that much of what they may gain, and this is what I worry about, is that they may gain a certain credibility, that you belong to this, this good housekeeping group. This is not, I don't think your group exactly is comparable to the good housekeeping seal of approval, but I think that can be used as an advertising thing. We belong to NATSAP, and obviously we are good. I think you have something to prove to this committee and to the American public that you are supplying more than just credibility to these groups that belong to you. And I worry about that. I think very often people see a national organization and feel it is something like the Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval. I think you have a long ways to go before you ever approach that. I think what I worry about is that you supply them just credibility.
Sir, that is why we are here asking for your help in state licensure and regulation. We do not want to be the Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval. We want to supply services to our members so that they can improve the care that they give to children and families.
Congressman, could I just add one thing?
Yes.
In the marketing materials, and again, this isn't NATSAP's responsibility, but these entities do market themselves as being members of NATSAP, and it does provide some credentials for them, even though they're a trade association, so they're not really required to do due diligence necessarily. So that is something we saw in the marketing materials for many of our case studies that were NATSAP members or other members of other associations or whatever the case may be.
But they could, an organization could use that in their advertising. We're a member of NATSAP, right?
They did. Not could, they did.
And so it is used, and it does give them a certain credibility perhaps to the people.
Someone who might not be aware of what it exactly means, yes.
But it sounds good, right, that they belong to this
it sounds good.
national organization.
If I could comment, because I do receive calls from families on a weekly basis at this point, and this point is absolutely what I'm hearing from families, that they are having such difficulty because there is not a place that they can go on the web or some kind of a clearinghouse where they can get information about programs, both good programs and programs of concern. And so they are desperately trying to make sense based on the information that's out there. And absolutely, when you have a seal on a website that's the Joint Commission seal, and right next to it you have a NATSAP logo seal, I have heard multiple parents saying, yes, but it's a NATSAP-affiliated program. It's a NATSAP-accredited program. So even though NATSAP says we are not about accreditation, that's how parents are making sense of it. And I am seriously concerned about the mixed messages that are going to families, because although NATSAP is saying that they are trying to help families, I do not understand why, when NATSAP attended a presentation that Paul Lewis, myself, and several other individuals made last year at the American Psychological Association conference, where we indicated that there were hundreds of reports of mistreatment and abuse in these kinds of facilities. Why was it that after that presentation, when NATSAP representatives came up and expressed such concern and said something very similar to what Ms. Moss just said, when she just said, well, we will take these back to our board and review them in depth? That was the same kind of language that we got last year. And what was the response? The response was the open letter to critics that now is on the NATSAP website that describes the concerns that we have reported in these presentations at the APA and elsewhere as, quote, the noisy complaints of a few individuals. So that is not sending a message to families that NATSAP takes these reports of abuse seriously. And I have not seen evidence that they have done anything in response to what we have made very clear in the presentations that we've done over the last 2 years, that this is something that is a great concern to them.
But I think we're all concerned up here. I think we're all parents up here, and I can't imagine the pain three parents have suffered. But really, if you belong to an organization that deals with the most vulnerable in our society, the youth, you should be part of the solution and not part of the problem.
Sir, that's why we are here. We
Well,
want
I'm
to
glad
be a
you're
part
here.
of the solution.
Go ahead.
We want to be a part of the solution. That is why we are here.
But I hope then that you supply us the information I requested, and I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Either Mr. Coots or Ms. Clark Harvey, have there been additional deaths at the facilities program since your daughter died?
Yes, there were 2 deaths in Catherine Freer programs after Erica died. One occurred in Nevada, close, I believe, in the same wilderness area that Erica died in, and that occurred in October of 2002. And then there was a death in Oregon in, I believe, March of 2003.
That's correct.
That's correct with the information you have. Again, I mean, this is not to make this NATSAP's problem, but you got 5 out of 10 deaths here that are facilities that belong to your organization. 2 of the 5 have been closed. 1 has had additional deaths since Erica Harvey. I mean, this is like Casablanca. You're shocked that gambling's going on here. Something's very wrong inside of a trade organization. One of the things trade organizations have to decide is you got to get rid of the frauds, and if you want to survive, and somehow something's wrong here in the review or the applications or the self-certification or something that people can bring this kind of history and just continue on. Now, maybe that's fine. You're obviously making a determination. You're leading this committee to believe you're making changes. But I just say that there's a period of years here when somebody was asleep at the switch here, and I appreciate the 3 testimonies that were attached to Ms. Moss to your testimony. 3 statements by people who had been through different programs and their success, and that's what every parent would wish for. I find that terribly interesting, but not terribly relevant. because that would be the expectation of people who signed up for these programs. That would be their hope. Not that every kid's going to come back successful as they've decided they've gone on with their lives, they've become productive, and they've done those things. But that your child would get treatment. At a minimum, you would expect there to be safely kept while they were in care. And that minimum was breached here time and time and time, in fact, thousands of times. That has been breached by people taking care of these children. And so I guess that's why we're here when things go terribly wrong, and I think Ms. Pinto has pointed out much of this behavior or being subjected to this, people don't lightly disgorge to others that they were abused or that they couldn't cut it or they couldn't do these things. And so I think to have people come back now in the numbers that have, and to talk about it, this can't be dismissed as noise.
No, sir, it cannot be dismissed as noise, and I agree with that. NATSAP would benefit from a clearinghouse of information as much as a parent and family would. We do not want to be the good housekeeping seal of approval. We do want to raise the bar in the industry. We are a young organization learning as we're going. We have made mistakes in the past. We recognize that.
There's some duty of care here. Which
absolutely,
I think
sir, I agree with that.
I think you're missing it, with all due respect. You can decide for the moment, but I think you're missing it. There's some duty of care here, quote, as a trade organization, about what happens in your name.
I will take that back to the board, sir, very definitely.
It's going to be a very busy board. You're taking
yes, it is, sir. Very busy.
Ms. Pinto, you raised the question. I'm trying to figure out what it means when these are individuals who have gone through the program, for them to come forward, and what weight we give that.
Mm-hmm. Again, I think it's easy for people to presume that there must be something wrong with these young adults. Maybe they're, well, they were troubled teens to begin with, so they're probably just still messed up, and that's why they're describing this, and they're trying to get the programs. However, if you read the accounts, and I was really surprised that when we created this online survey with over 100 questions and many free response opportunities, it's over 1,000 pages just trying to print out all of the responses that came back. This is definitely a group of folks who haven't had an opportunity to speak to their experience. And when you read the accounts, when you hear what people have to say, there really is a level of detail and coherence to their accounts, any given account, but then also across accounts that makes it clear that there is a phenomenon occurring, a phenomenon of mistreatment and abuse. And it is not the case that everybody is experiencing this, but it is the case that there are far more than just a few cases. And again, if we heard this from a teenager who is in their own home or in a public school or in a licensed mental health care facility, immediately there would be a response, and it would be an investigation to ensure that that just did not go overlooked, and that's not happening at this point.
In fact, there's an affirmative duty to report.
Absolutely, and in fact,
not by any professional.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a licensed psychologist, and as such, I'm a mandated reporter of suspected child abuse. And when I first started getting these reports, I thought, my gosh, as a mandated reporter, I need to follow up with this. And so I called several states suspected child abuse hotlines, and I described the situation to them. And they said, well, can you give us the name of the particular staff member who was the one to conduct this suspected abuse? And I said, well, no, but I can give you the name of the program. And they said, if you cannot give us the name of the individual, then it needs to go to the agency at the state level that monitors those kinds of programs. We cannot take a report unless you give us the name of the individual. But then when I would call those agencies, Department of Education, Department of Health and Human Services, in the given state, they would say, well, we don't have any authority over those kinds of programs. And so it's a complete black hole at this point.
Well, thank you very much. And I think that's a problem also that exists between public programs. I mean, one of the reasons I fought very hard over the years to return children to their own states, because once you cross the state line, one whether you have any authority, and two, getting other people to respond. It just becomes a huge barrier, and our state and others have changed the law so the kids are placed differently now than they were 20 years ago or 15 years ago when kids out of placement. Carolyn, do you have an additional question?
Actually, she just answered it, because I wanted to go in. We are giving federal money to the states, and yet they don't seem to have any control over what that money is doing as far as these residential programs. So that might be an area we will not.
Let me follow up on that, Mr. Kutz, if I might. And you weren't looking at the question of whether there's federal money for some of these programs. And do you have any sense of, we have 4B money, maintenance money for children out of home placements in foster care and whatever. We know in the past some of these children were used, out-of-state placements were made with 4B money. You have juvenile justice money that goes to placement. I don't know whether some of these contract with school districts to receive funding within their state. I'm just trying to think, is there any reason to suspect that there is some federal involvement in the placement of the, federal dollars?
Not in the cases we looked at. They were funded primarily by parents, and in one case, health insurance paid for maybe $10,000 of the fees.
So they're as far as you can tell, they're operating essentially on a tuition
yes.
Payment by parents.
If I could add to that just briefly, if that's okay?
Yes.
It does seem like primarily the parents I've spoken to are paying out of pocket as well. However, there are times where a child, a family makes a case, for instance, through their IEP, that the publicly available programs or the non-public schools that are part of that district's list of available services are not a good fit for their child, and they advocate to have their child sent to one of these kinds of private programs. And there are districts, I do recall from my clinical work in California, where that does occur, and programs, therapeutic boarding schools are paid for through the IEP process.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
May I follow up with a question? As we've heard all the testimony, that, and especially the data areas where I would like to see if we can concentrate that in the future if we do legislation. Right now, apparently, HHS does have money that's given to the National Child Abuse and Neglect Data System. With what we see, where do you think is some states will call the child abuse centers, some will call the state agencies. As we go forward, what would be the best area to collect the data and not have several agencies go through it, but one agency, so that it's a better clearinghouse and not a confusion to parents when they need to know that data? Do you have any idea? Or will that come in the next study?
Not necessarily, but the data that you're talking about, the data that was collected nationally was a self-reporting, so it's more than likely very incomplete. There were 30-some states, I think, that reported. Not that every state has these programs. I don't know whether they do or don't, but certainly some central reliable repository would be useful, whether it's at the federal level or not. I mean, maybe from a reporting standpoint, that would make the most sense. The states could report to the federal government. But again, that current database that was used, again, that's why we can't say how many thousand or whatever. It was self-reporting.
Okay. And Ms. Morrison, just to finish off with one thing I've learned since being here in Congress, I also sit on financial services. And when a trade organization puts their name out and gives the seal of approval of a corporation or an entity that they're supporting, the only thing they have is their reputation. And if you're supporting that reputation, those clients or family members usually will look at that and think that you've already done the investigation. So whether it's your fault or not, I think you need to look at your organization and maybe possibly decide that you might should be doing some of your own investigation if you want to keep your reputation. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Any further questions? Well, let me thank all of you for your time and your testimony and your expertise in this area. I think it's been very helpful to us. Mr. McKeon and I'll put our heads together, and I think where we go from here, we have a follow-on study from GAO, and as you can see, there's considerable interest by the members of the committee that we somehow get a handle on this, what's taking place here, and get about trying to keep it from happening. But we'll have to figure out what the right vehicle is, but we will figure that out. I want to tell you that. And with your help, and I hope that you will continue to stay involved with us. To the family members, thank you for your testimony. I know this wasn't easy for you, and thank you, though, for sharing that with us. And Ms. Moss, Ms. Pinto, thank you for your expertise. And Mr. Coots and Mr. O'Connell, I know this wasn't an easy study for you to do, but we appreciate it and appreciate your frankness in dealing with the committee. Members will have the ability to submit statements for the next 14 days. Is that right? 14 days. And with that, the committee will stand adjourned. Thank you again. Thank you.